Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of LInn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Diehl. I'm currently the Vice President of the Interreligious Council of LInn County. On this morning's show, we're going to discuss the topic inequality, wealth inequality in the United States. And here to discuss this topic with me, I have three wonderful guests, and I'd like you to take just a short bit and introduce yourself and what you do and why this particular topic of wealth inequality is of interest to you.
So my name is Maurice Davis. I'm the program coordinator for a entrepreneurship program at Jane Boyd. And I would say when I think about why wealth inequality is so important, it's because I really deal with folks that are in the impoverished area and kind of underserved that really deal with this on a day-to-day basis.
All right, thank you.
My name is Natalie Veldhouse. I am a research associate with the Iowa Policy Project. We research how public policies in Iowa impact low-income Iowans. We look at things like our tax and budget policy and look at jobs and poverty and all these different areas, the cost of living. And I would say that I'm interested in issues like wealth inequality just to make sure that, in Iowa and in the U.S., people who are working or just that everyone is able to meet their basic needs in our country that is doing so well by certain measures.
All right. Thank you, Natalie.
My name is Dave Frisvold. I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of Iowa. And I've done research on food assistance programs, anti-poverty programs. And so a lot of my interest is related to poverty, which is related to some degree to wealth inequality.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you each for being here. So before we kind of dive into the topic, I want to kind of set the stage here for a little bit of what we're up against, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was reading here just recently, actually, an article from the New York Times that came out on November 11th by Michael Tomasky. It's an opinion columnist. And he, I think, put it rather succinctly, kind of the feeling that's out there, right, amongst Americans and certain demographics of wealth inequality and its impact on our country. And he says, any democracy needs a robust and thriving middle class, and we have spent the last 30 or so years transferring dollars from the middle class to the people at the very top, kind of famously referred to as the 1%. Just one set of numbers from the University of California, Berkeley, economist Gabriel Zuckman, the 400 richest Americans, the top 0.00025% of the population, now own more of the country's wealth than the richest, own more of the country's wealth than 150 million adults in the bottom 60% of wealth distribution. These 400 share has tripled since the 1980s. He says, this is carnage, plain and simple. No democratic society can let that keep happening and expect to stay a democracy. It will produce a middle and working class with no sense that the system is providing them with basic security. They'll make some odd and desperate choices. So he puts it pretty starkly there, and he, paints a kind of a grim picture of what wealth inequality can mean for a democracy like the United States. And when we're talking about wealth, by the way, one of the common definitions is simply the value of our possessions, albeit like automobiles, personal valuables, businesses, savings, investments, etc. But I do want you to we'll start out here kind of responding to that feeling there, that wealth inequality is, something that potentially could tear apart the fabric of our society. Is that something, a fear that you have, a fear that you share, or not? And feel free to, whoever wants to jump in here.
I would say yes, in a kind of like subconscious back of the mind statement. The problem with wealth inequality and having so vastly grown is that when you're at the bottom and you can't see a way up, it creates a feeling of hopelessness. And when you have that feeling of hopelessness, you know, it puts you in a position where nothing else really matters. And you know, he says, as you were reading, he says, you know, they will make some odd and desperate choices. And when those choices become irrational, we tend to make really bad decisions that kind of put us farther behind, whether that means jail time, you know, further debt or additional issues. And then that only continues to compound the problem.
Interesting. Do either of you have a particular comment or feeling about it?
I think that as wealth inequality grows, it really flies in the face of what we're really supposed to be able to achieve in the U.S. If you think about, you know, people being able to get ahead while they're working, and, you know, people being able, you know, a family being able to put their kids through college or save for retirement and do all those different things. If we're in a situation where a very small group of people have a very high concentration of wealth, and that means that other families do not have those kinds of opportunities, it's really, it's making things sticky at the top and bottom, where it's harder for people at the bottom of the income distribution to get ahead, even if they are, you know, pursuing more education or, you know, working full time. They can still not be able to make ends meet because, you know, your wealth is kind of your social safety net that keeps you from falling into debt because of a medical emergency or so many unforeseen things that happen in people's lives. So we really need to think about the quality of life that many Americans are looking at if they're working full time and they're still not able to make ends meet. So there's a point where you need to start questioning whether the economic system, if we need it to just be working for a smaller set of fewer people at the top, or whether we need to make sure that our public policies are working for a broader, you know, group of Americans and Iowans.
Okay, thank you. And David, do you have any thoughts on?
I guess there's been some work that has shown that inequality has risen over time, you know, and as it's rising, you know, I think that quote is getting to this idea that some people may feel that they're not adequately rewarded for the work that they're doing, and you know, that may not necessarily be a society that people want to create, where individuals have different opportunities and they feel that they're rewarded for their efforts, and they have new opportunities that they can reach to. And so as inequality has been rising, you know, some people may feel a lot of discontent. And I think that's what the quote's getting at.
Yeah, so there's, I've heard mentioned a couple times this idea of hope, right, or hopelessness, that if those that are at the bottom percentage, whatever percentile, whatever that may be, can feel a sense of hopelessness. But I guess I want to push back against that a little bit. I was doing some research on it, and the traditionally wealthier but unequal countries such as Singapore, Hong Kong, studies have shown that they tend to be socially healthier than more equal but poorer countries such as Eastern European countries. And sociologists point to unequal countries actually being what they call swamped by hope, at least as a kind of a theory of why that is. I mean, do you agree that with this idea that even, you know, there may be wealth inequality and it could be great, but there's this feeling that, oh, I can achieve that. You know, maybe if I come up with a great idea, I could be the next Bill Gates, or I could be the next Elon Musk, or I could be the next Warren Buffett, or whatever the case may be. I could be the next LeBron James, if you will, from an athletic perspective. Do you feel like there's value there? Do you feel like there is some cash value when it comes to hope in that kind of a system?
Ooh, so this is one of those like lean in moments.
Yeah.
I think there's benefit to a certain extent. Yes, it is nice to know that, you know, if I put in, you know, 150%, there's a chance that I can rise above. But if we really think about it, when you're at that bottom, and there are all types of analogies we can use, but if you start 400-meter race and you start at the 200-meter mark and I still got the whole 400 to run, it's going to be hard for me to win. You know, when we talk about some of the top 400 richest people, and I can't remember what article I was reading, but it said like 60% of those people started with money. And so there's something to be said about, you know, starting from a place where I'm afforded opportunities to be able to get what I need in order to kind of put me in the best position in order to be successful. There are a lot of people that have really great ideas, but they just don't know how to start. And when you're dealing with things like, I don't know how I'm going to pay my lights, or, you know, I'm wondering how I'm going to eat, or you mentioned being able to put my kids through college, the last thing you're thinking about is, how do I make this widget work? Even though it could be the best thing, and that's the thing that you need in order to kind of put your family in that position to be the next Bill Gates or the next Sam Walton, or whatever that position is that you're looking for. But you can't think about that. You know, we think about like the hierarchy of needs. I have to focus on safety and security first. And if I can't get that, then all that other stuff is useless.
Yeah, yeah. So there's this idea that it's just very difficult, the lower you go, if you will, on the wealth spectrum, right? Like the more difficult it is. And just, you know, simple numbers, right? People have talked about those that have wealth, it's easier to retain it, right?
Absolutely.
And that has a snowball effect. So if I have $100 million in the bank and I get a 10% return, I've just generated $10 million, right? Like, but somebody that has no wealth and there's, you know, generational poverty that they're experiencing, to come up with $10 million in capital, right, would be it's beyond their wildest dreams how they would even go about doing that, right? So you have, you find people in difficult positions where it's not just, well, go out and get wealth. It's much more difficult, although not impossible.
No, absolutely.
Do you guys agree with that sentiment? Is there anything else you want to add?
I think it's interesting to think about what's going on economically in the U.S. and sometimes we really hear people talking about our economy as if it's this natural organism that just runs on its own and self-corrects and can't touch it. But really it's really heavily influenced by public policies, and a lot of public policy has a hand in the economic realities that people are facing. So you can think about wealth inequality and think about the historical policies that have shaped what we're seeing today. Like a lot of things that are talked about when you think about wealth inequality are racial disparities in wealth, and looking at how white-headed households just have astronomically more wealth than families of color, and that wasn't just something that happened naturally or was just kind of an oops. You know, you can go back and look at a history of public policies like redlining, or, you know, just perpetual disinvestments in communities of color where families were not able to borrow money to, you know, buy a house or something where you can build equity, be building that kind of wealth. And that, you know, in this economic system and this history, that certain groups of people were left out of the equation. And we see that playing out today, and it's important to, you know, tie the disparities that we're seeing with the historical context.
Yeah, I was preparing, that's a great point. I was preparing for the show. My son, he shared with me a couple of videos that he had been watching on the gender pay gap, the racial pay gap, wealth gap generally, right? And just all the different policies, the you know, cultural kind of artifacts that have contributed to that over time. And you know, in some instances expanded that, and it's very, and in many cases, especially with like the gender pay gap, it isn't necessarily intuitive why that's happening. Sometimes it can be just leave policies at work that tend to, at different employers that tend to favor female workers over male workers, and how over time that can create a disparity in the wealth. And so very, very interesting. David, do you have any other thoughts?
I mean, I guess it seems like your two questions or prompts are getting at kind of this idea of what's the right amount of wealth inequality, right? And is it kind of where we are now? Is the answer 0? And that's kind of the two, you know, examples that it seemed like you were going with. You know, and I think that, you know, it's one of these things where if it is, you know, if there are no differences, right? So, you know, I think what you were getting at was the idea that then there may not be that much incentive. And so if there are no incentives for individuals to work harder to save, then they may not be better off, I think is kind of the basic point you were getting at. And so it may not be the case that no wealth inequality is optimal. But that also doesn't mean that extreme wealth inequality is optimal either, right? So there needs to be perhaps, say, some middle point where there are lots of incentives to save, to invest, to to work hard, to complete more education, to try out more riskier creative endeavors that could pay off or may not. Right. So if there are those incentives, maybe society would still be better off.
So yeah, I think I want to focus in now on really this idea of wealth inequality, the gap, and talking a little bit about, is it morally wrong for one person to have more wealth than another person? Is there a limit on that? I mean, certainly we know that just by trying and getting up every day and going to work is going to create inevitably some sort of inequality in a society, right, as they have wealth. I mean, certainly historical societies that virtually had no wealth at all, it was not an issue, right? But none of us want to go back to that, right? None of us want to have to, kill for our food and kill each other for food and, things of that nature. So we appreciate the ability to acquire wealth, but that comes with it inequality. So do you feel that inequality is inevitable, wealth inequality is inevitable? If it is inevitable, what is morally acceptable? What is ethically acceptable? I mean, people point to the Jeff Bezos of the world, the owner of Amazon, with $113 billion, I think, as of close of the market today. So what do you think? I mean, just generally, is there something morally wrong with one person acquiring such great wealth while other people have virtually none?
I think when I'm thinking about this, I think about two different terms. You can think about absolute poverty, where you're talking about, is someone able to meet their basic needs, versus relative poverty. So there's always going to be the bottom 20% of any country. So kind of thinking about the difference between those two, within the US, there will always be the bottom 20%, but what does the quality of life look like for that group of people? And I guess you're talking about what's fair, what isn't fair, but I think that it's really important that in a country, that you could say is, the richest in the nation, depending on how you're cutting that, does it make sense for the lowest 20% to have issues, securing housing or, having enough food to eat and all those certain kinds of things. So I don't have like a yes or no or a certain number. But it begs the question: that when is the threshold of when it becomes unacceptable?
And it's a difficult question to answer, right? I mean, intuitively think that much wealth, which is incomprehensible to us, seems like it shouldn't be right. But drawing that line becomes difficult. David, do you have a thought on it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that it seems like people's view on whether or not that would be considered fair could depend on the reasons why the wealth was generated. And so I think that plays a role, and I do think there tends to be a focus on, the bottom portion of the wealth distribution and concerns for welfare of individuals in the bottom portion of the wealth distribution, just like Natalie was saying. But I think that when people think that differences in wealth are generated by the choices that people make, like in terms of how hard they work, how much they save, things like that, that's one thing. And I think that people people are going to have different perspectives on that, but I think people are much more likely to view that is fair. If the differences result from the choices individuals make. If the differences in wealth are viewed or come about because of differences in, say, inheritances, differences in, like Natalie mentioned, unfair lending practices, things like that, then I think people are much more likely to not view the wealth inequality as fair.
Yeah, and there's studies that point to, as I was researching for that for this program, that certainly was true, and that that inequality isn't necessarily synonymous or shouldn't be synonymous with unfairness per se, and that people, as long as they felt like the system was fair, right? Like these people didn't acquire their wealth through nefarious means or illegal means, but they, some of the examples, for instance, J.K. Rowling, right? She wrote her book, the Harry Potter series, right? And amongst others, and by it became a billionaire, right? And people, in some sense, feel like, okay, that's all right. She was able to spread joy and happiness to untold millions of people, but in the process, seems fairly enough, became a billionaire. But it's with people that it becomes a little bit more difficult, right? When people, how did they acquire their wealth? How did they come about that? Financiers of the world, for instance, right? That, it seems like, oh, maybe something nefarious is going on, that it creates that, I think, social instability that we're driving at. But interesting. So I think what I'm hearing, especially from you, Natalie, is that there is, as long as we feel like, and this is the argument, right? That yes, there is wealth that's consolidated towards. We've read some numbers here, that 1% or the top 10%, but the exchange on that, right, was the fact that the bottom are being raised. The all boats are being raised, and there are studies that have shown. I mean, just simply put here. More than 95% of American households below the poverty line in the United States have electricity, running water, flushing toilets, a refrigerator, a stove, and a color TV. Well, a century and a half before that, the Rothschilds, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers of the world, whose combined wealth exceeded over $1 trillion, right? Had none of that, right? So the argument is that, yes, there is wealth inequality, but it's also created a tremendous amount of wealth for the bottom percent, so that what it means to be poor today in America is not what it means, not even close to what it meant to be poor or even rich 150 years ago. What do you think about that argument, that inequality is wealth inequality, even extreme wealth inequality? I'm kind of pushing it here. I'm trying to kind of get a reaction from you, but even extreme wealth inequality is necessary in order to generate more wealth, expand that pie. Do you think that's a strong argument or no?
I think the idea of comparing life now to life 150 years ago and saying, but it's better, is almost comparing the idea that someone can function today with a horse and a buggy. And we wouldn't suggest that an individual who has a horse and a buggy is living the American dream. And so even though now we have people that have color TVs and all these other great things, electricity, they still function in situations where sometimes it's not on because they can't pay it. And so, yes, throughout time we've kind of lifted up what everyone has available to them, but it's still, in all actuality, it created another bill. Now I have to pay electricity where 150 years ago I didn't. I can go out and chop down a couple trees and heat my house. Well, I can't do that anymore. And so now that creates more strain on my family, whereas before it was about how can I go out and be sustaining on my own. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, no, I think you're touching on a very interesting idea, right? Which is, kind of not a mindset, but just this idea that it's very difficult to compare to what we had in the past, right? When it comes to wealth, or didn't have in the past, right? We're going back to Natalie's term of relative wealth, right? Versus relative poverty versus absolute poverty. Relative poverty is always going to exist. There's always going to be people with more wealth. There's always going to be somebody with the bigger house, with more cars, the bigger bank account, right? Yep. So in that sense, there is always going to be that. But in terms of, and this is what I was getting at, the kind of that absolute poverty, what does it mean to be poor in the United States? It seems empirically is changing and arguably improving over time. But again, do you, David or Natalie, do you approve of that? It sounds like Maurice, you're kind of pushing back against that notion.
I am.
What are your guys' thoughts on it?
I think the research shows us that poverty in the U.S. can be dynamic. It's not there is chronic poverty, but some people are kind of making it one month and then they're not making it another. So let's say, you have a kid and they have a PlayStation and then one month you're unable to make rent, or, you get your power cut off. Are you supposed to sell everything in your house to improve your economic situation? I don't know how helpful it is to think about, whether someone has an iPhone or not. If you're thinking about how, just something like how the average person who graduated from college from a public university in Iowa is graduating with almost $30,000 in debt, if they do have debt, it's hard to compare all those things at once. If you think about, people inheriting money and having kind of this safety net that other people don't have, there's just a lot going on. And I think something that we've kind of touched on already is talking about basically equal opportunity. Is there equal opportunity in the U.S.? If you do what you're supposed to do and, follow this kind of formula that might have worked a long time ago, like decades ago, where you maybe sometime wasn't quite, it was before I was born, but in the 1970s or the 1960s, if someone could graduate high school, work as a janitor or something, probably the wife is at home, and you can buy a house and have 2 cars, and you can put a kid through college. That's not the same economic reality that we're living in today. And I think a lot of people carry those assumptions forward. And today, if someone isn't making it or is having trouble making ends meet, someone thinks, oh, it's just their own fault. They didn't do this, they didn't do that. But really, what the research is showing us is that a lot of public policies are shaping these realities more so than individual choices.
Excellent. So we just have a couple minutes left, and I want to, both Maurice and Natalie, you deal with individuals here in Iowa locally and across the state, and I think we all agree that we want to continue to lift people out of poverty, right? We can all agree on that. Whether inequality goes away or not, we want to continue to do that. What is, just 30 seconds each, what's one thing that the state of Iowa can do, or even an individual can do, to help raise people out of poverty?
So I would say one of the things, and this isn't from me, it's from a seminar that I went to, but it's remove arbitrary licensing restrictions. So you have things like, if someone wants to braid hair, now I need to have a license to be a licensed cosmetologist. Well, you're not dealing with chemicals. That shouldn't be a thing.
Right.
And so they have to create debt in order to get that licensing.
Okay, excellent, thank you. In 1 minute, Natalie.
Okay, I would say raise the minimum wage and index it to the cost of living, strengthen worker protections so that people are able to bargain for better wages, and also increase tax fairness so that lower income Iowans aren't paying a larger share of their income on state and local taxes.
And David, we have a whole 30 seconds left. You have the floor.
So I would actually say a useful resource for this is the National Academy of Sciences recently had a panel that looked at how to cut child poverty in half in the next 10 years. And they did an excellent job coming up with a few solutions, one of which would be a child allowance. So this would be, these are all basically simple changes to the federal tax code that could substantially reduce child poverty. And I think those are probably the easiest way to have a deep impact, or a big impact. That's a focus on poverty as opposed to wealth inequality, which is different.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Again, an extremely complex subject that we barely scratched the surface on, but I appreciate all 3 of you joining me this morning, and I hope you enjoyed it as well as the viewer, and I hope you have a great rest of your Sunday. Take care now. Bye.